There's a pattern in history that has destroyed global superpowers without firing a single shot. Not with armies, not with bombs, but with financial tools, systems that were once neutral, then quietly turned into weapons. And right now, in 2024, 2025, today, your country is walking through that pattern step by step. In February 2022, the world watched as Russia was cut off from SWIFT, the nervous system of global finance. Politicians called it a financial nuclear option. Commentators celebrated, markets cheered. The assumption was simple: control the system, and you control the outcome. But history never works that way, because the moment a financial system stops being neutral, the moment it becomes a weapon, trust doesn't weaken slowly, it fractures instantly, and once trust breaks, power begins to leak, quietly, invisibly, permanently. This isn't about Russia. This isn't about sanctions. This is about what happens every single time an empire believes it can weaponize the infrastructure everyone else depends on. Spain did it. Britain did it. The Soviet Union did it. And now, in this exact moment, the United States is doing it too. By the end of this video, you'll be able to place your country, your currency, and your own financial life inside a repeating historical cycle, and see which stage we're in right now. Because three empires made the same decision, and none of them stayed on top afterward. Keep that thought. Because to understand what's happening to your money today, we need to zoom out first. Every empire reaches a moment where it looks at history and decides it no longer applies to them. They say their technology is better. Their institutions are stronger. Their currency is too important to fail. And every single time, that belief becomes the beginning of the end. To understand what's happening right now, in 2024, in 2025, you have to step back far enough to see the full map. Not headlines, not politics, but patterns that stretch across centuries. Start with Spain in the 1500s. It controlled oceans, it controlled trade routes, it controlled the flow of gold and silver into Europe. Spain believed money was power, and as long as it controlled the money, it could fund wars, dominate rivals, and rule indefinitely. What followed wasn't invasion, it was inflation, currency debasement, loss of trust. Spain didn't collapse overnight. It faded into irrelevance while still believing it was rich. Then Britain. By the early 1900s, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun never set on its territory. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. Trade, insurance, shipping, all cleared through London. Britain didn't think it could lose that position, until two world wars forced it to borrow massively, weaponize its financial reach, and mortgage the future to survive the present. By 1944, the world quietly chose a new center of gravity. Not because Britain was weak, but because trust had shifted. Then the Soviet Union. It didn't run on markets or global trade dominance, but it still relied on a closed financial system, rigid controls, and political enforcement. When pressure mounted and confidence evaporated, the system didn't bend. It snapped. No invasion, no final battle, just economic suffocation. Different systems, different ideologies, same outcome. And here's the key pattern most people miss. None of these empires collapsed at the peak of panic. They collapsed at the peak of confidence, when leaders believed the system itself could no longer be questioned. That's the dangerous phase, because this is the moment when empires stop asking, "What if this fails?" and start assuming it can't. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, it should. Today you're told the dollar is indispensable, that global trade cannot function without it, that no serious alternative exists. Those exact phrases appear again and again in historical records, right before dominance slips away. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent tomorrow. History doesn't work on headlines. It works on momentum, on gradual shifts in trust, on quiet hedges made by countries, corporations, and institutions that don't want to be trapped when rules suddenly change. And this is where things get personal, because when a reserve system starts to wobble, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up first in your grocery bill, your rent, your savings account earning less while prices climb faster. You're told it's temporary. You're told it's external. You're told not to worry. That reassurance has a long track record. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. And in the next part, we're going to stop speaking in abstractions and zoom into one empire that believed it could borrow, control, and punish its way to permanent dominance. Because once you see that story clearly, you'll recognize its shadow everywhere today. Here's the part of history that's often told backwards. Britain didn't lose its empire because it was weak. It didn't lose because it was defeated on the battlefield. It lost because it won, and paid for that victory with debt it could never truly escape. At the start of the 20th century, Britain sat at the center of the world's financial system. London was the clearinghouse of global trade. The pound sterling was trusted everywhere. If you wanted to insure ships, settle contracts, move capital, you went through Britain. This was stage one of the pattern: control the system. Then came World War I. To survive, Britain did something that would quietly change its destiny. It borrowed heavily, not just from its own citizens, but from the rising power across the Atlantic, the United States. Debt was framed as temporary, necessary, patriotic, and for a while, it worked. But war has a way of normalizing the extraordinary. Borrowing became routine. Financial leverage became policy. And by World War II, Britain was no longer just defending an empire. It was mortgaging one. By 1945, Britain had technically won again. Flags still flew, maps still looked impressive. But beneath the surface, the numbers told a different story. The country was drowning in debt. Its gold reserves were depleted. Its financial independence was gone. And then came the quiet moment most people never hear about. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the global financial system was redesigned. Not violently, not dramatically, calmly, professionally, with spreadsheets and signatures. The pound lost its central role. The dollar took its place. No invasion, no collapse ceremony, just a shift in trust. Here's what that looked like for ordinary people. Imagine a dock worker in Liverpool in the late 1940s. He'd survived bombings, food rationing, years of sacrifice. He expected peace to mean relief. Instead, he faced stagnant wages, higher taxes, shrinking opportunity. The empire he was told he'd fought for no longer existed in any meaningful financial sense. Britain didn't collapse overnight. It entered a long, quiet decline. One measured not in headlines, but in lost influence and reduced choices. This is stage two of the pattern: overreach financed by debt. And here's the crucial lesson. Britain didn't believe it was abusing the system. It believed it was the system. That belief is lethal, because once an empire assumes its financial infrastructure is indispensable, it starts using it aggressively to fund wars, to enforce compliance, to punish rivals, without considering the long-term cost. This isn't a bug. This is the system working exactly as designed. The debt didn't just weaken Britain, it taught the rest of the world a lesson. Never depend entirely on someone else's currency if they can change the rules when it suits them. If any of this feels familiar, it should. Because today, you're living inside a softer, more complex version of the same story. Borrowing framed as normal, debt treated as harmless, confidence presented as permanence. And just like Britain, the consequences don't show up first at the top. They show up in households, in shrinking purchasing power, in futures that quietly get smaller. If this case study feels like ancient history, good, because in the next part, we're going to move much closer to home, to a collapse that happened early, quietly, and gave the world a preview of what systemic decline actually looks like. There's a dangerous myth about collapse, that it's loud, that it's sudden, that you'll see it coming with sirens and headlines. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, years before anyone admits what it is. And to see that clearly, you have to look at Russia, not in 2022, much earlier. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union didn't fall because it lost a war. It fell because its economic system stopped functioning. Supply chains froze, currency trust evaporated, savings vanished overnight. For ordinary people, collapse didn't feel ideological. It felt personal. Picture a middle-aged engineer in Moscow in 1992. His job still exists. His skills still matter. But his salary can no longer buy food for his family. That's what systemic failure looks like at ground level. Now, here's the part that matters for today. After the chaos of the 1990s, Russia learned a hard lesson. Dependence is vulnerability. Not morally, not politically, structurally. So, When the first major Western sanctions hit in 2014, something changed. The reaction wasn't panic, it was preparation. Russia didn't assume the system would protect it. It assumed the system could be turned against it. That moment marks stage 3 of the pattern. The target begins building alternatives. They reduce dollar exposure, they increase gold reserves, they develop domestic payment systems, they expanded bilateral trade in local currencies. This wasn't defiance, it was insulation. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. When Russia was cut off from SWIFT in 2022, the West believed it was demonstrating power. But what it actually demonstrated was precedent. Every finance minister in the world saw the same thing. If access to the global financial system can be revoked for political reasons, then access is never guaranteed. That realization didn't push countries toward Russia. It pushed them toward risk management. And risk management doesn't announce itself. It shows up as quiet hedges, as parallel systems, as trade agreements denominated in something other than dollars. This is the moment where weaponization stops working the way it used to. Because once alternatives exist, even imperfect ones, power begins to leak. Slowly, silently, but permanently. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented behavior. No one needs to overthrow the dollar for its dominance to weaken. They only need to ensure they're not trapped if rules change again. And that's the key distinction most people miss. Russia didn't win by being sanctioned. It survived long enough to show others what survival looks like. That example mattered far more than any headline, because collapse patterns don't spread through ideology. They spread through observation. If you're a neutral country, one that trades with everyone, the lesson is simple. Never put all your lifelines in someone else's hands. And if that logic makes sense at the national level, it should feel uncomfortably familiar at the personal level too. Because when systems become brittle, the first instinct isn't rebellion, it's backup plans. Which brings us to the heart of this story. What looks like punishment on the surface often functions as education underneath. And in the next part, we're going to stop talking about countries and lock this entire story into a simple, repeatable framework. One you can recognize anywhere, including right now. At this point, the story should start to feel familiar. Different countries, different ideologies, different centuries. But the same sequence keeps repeating. That's because what you're watching isn't chaos, it's a structure. Once you strip away politics and personalities, financial dominance follows a very specific pattern. One that is replayed so consistently that you can almost treat it like physics. 5 stages, always in the same order, no exceptions. Let's lock it in. Stage 1. Control the system. A dominant power builds or inherits the core infrastructure: currency settlement, trade clearing, banking rails, reserve status. At this stage, the system feels neutral, even benevolent. Everyone benefits from efficiency and scale. This is when trust is highest. Stage 2. Weaponize the system. Control turns into leverage. Access becomes conditional. Sanctions, exclusions, freezes, penalties. The justification is always moral, or legal, or temporary. But the signal is unmistakable. This system is no longer neutral. This is the point of no return. Because the moment rules can be changed unilaterally, everyone else starts recalculating risk. Stage 3. Build alternatives. Not rebellions, not revolutions, backups, parallel payment systems, local currency trade, gold accumulation, bilateral agreements outside the dominant framework. These alternatives don't need to be better. They only need to exist. Stage 4. Neutral players. Hedge. This is the quietest and most dangerous Projektbereich stage. Countries that aren't targets don't protest. They don't announce anything. They simply reduce exposure. A little less dollar settlement, a little more diversification, a little more optionality. Individually, these moves look insignificant. Collectively, they change everything. Stage 5. Power decays. Not overnight, not dramatically, but structurally. The dominant system still exists, but it no longer monopolizes trust. And without monopoly trust, financial power becomes just another option. Here's the part most people struggle with. No one sits down and designs this collapse. It emerges from incentives. Short-term political wins outweigh long-term system health. Control today feels more valuable than credibility tomorrow. This isn't a bug. This is the system working exactly as designed. Now, pause for a moment. Because this framework doesn't just apply to empires, it applies to companies, to industries, to households. You've seen versions of it before. A job that once felt stable suddenly adds conditions. A bank that once welcomed you now penalizes you. A system you relied on quietly changes the rules. The moment rules change without your consent, trust doesn't disappear emotionally. It disappears mathematically. And here's the open loop you need to hold on to. Most people argue endlessly about whether the dollar is strong or weak. That's the wrong question. The real question is simpler and far more dangerous. Which stage are we in right now? Because once you know the stage, you stop being surprised by the symptoms. And in the next part, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to place 2024-2025 directly inside this 5-stage pattern, using data, not opinions, and see where the system actually stands, not where you're told it stands, where it behaves like it stands. If you want to know where a system is headed, don't listen to what leaders say. Watch what institutions do, because confidence is always verbal, but risk management is always behavioral. So, let's place 2024-2025 directly onto the 5-stage pattern, not emotionally, not politically, but structurally. Stage 1, control the system. This is the past. The dollar already won this phase decades ago. Global trade, energy pricing, reserves, settlement, insurance, clearing. This stage is no longer in question. Stage 2, weaponization. This is not theoretical, it's documented. Iran, 1979, Russia, 2014, Russia again, 2022. Assets frozen, banks disconnected, access revoked. Whether you believe those actions were justified is irrelevant to the pattern, because systems don't respond to morality. They respond to incentives, and the incentive message was received globally. Access is conditional. That alone pushes us out of stage 2 and firmly into the next phase. Stage 3, alternatives emerge. This is where things get uncomfortable, because it's already happening, not in headlines, in balance sheets. Dollar share of global reserves has been declining steadily. Cross-border trade in local currencies is increasing. Gold accumulation by central banks is accelerating. China's CIPC grows quietly alongside SWIFT. BRICS discussions move from theory to infrastructure. None of these replaces the dollar tomorrow. They don't need to. They only need to exist. Stage 4, neutral hedging. This is where we are right now, and this is the stage most people misunderstand. Countries aren't abandoning the dollar. They're insuring against it. A little less exposure here, a little more optionality there. Trade deals that avoid single-point failure. No press conferences, no ideological speeches, just silent rebalancing. This is the same phase Britain entered before losing reserve status. The same phase Spain ignored while gold lost credibility. The same phase every dominant system underestimates, because it feels invisible. But invisibility doesn't mean insignificance, because when enough players hedge at the same time, demand weakens at the margin, and currencies don't collapse at the center, they erode at the edges. Now, here's where this stops being abstract. You feel stage 4 in your life as higher interest rates that don't fully tame inflation, volatile markets that no longer rebound cleanly, rising costs that outpace wages, savings that grow numerically but shrink in purchasing power. You're told these are separate problems. They're not. They're symptoms of a system transitioning away from monopoly trust. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented behavior. The dollar hasn't been defeated. It's being priced. And pricing is ruthless. It doesn't care about legacy. It cares about risk. Now, here's the part that's usually left out of polite conversation. This transition doesn't hurt everyone equally. Some actors are positioned to benefit, regardless of which way the system tilts. They hedge earlier. They influence rules. They get access first. Which leads to the uncomfortable truth. This system didn't just evolve. It was shaped by people who understood exactly how each stage works and how to profit from the transition between them. And that's where we're going next, because once you understand who benefits from systemic stress, you stop blaming yourself for struggling inside it. Here's the uncomfortable part most documentaries avoid. When systems break, it doesn't happen by accident. And it doesn't hurt everyone equally, because while you experience instability as stress, uncertainty, and loss of purchasing power, others experience it as opportunity, not opportunism. Positioning. Every major financial system is shaped by a small group of decision makers long before the consequences reach ordinary people, not villains in dark rooms, but committees, institutions, incentives, bankers, regulators, rating agencies, large corporations with global reach. None of them need the system to be fair. They only need it to be predictable. This is the first trap. You don't get to opt out. You don't choose the currency your wages are paid in. You don't vote on the interest rate that decides whether you can afford a home. You don't negotiate the credit score model that quietly prices your entire future. The system assigns you a number, then charges you based on that number, then profits every time that number is checked, adjusted, or punished. That's not malfunction, that's design. The second trap is asymmetry. When ordinary people make mistakes, they absorb the full consequence. Late payment, higher interest, fees, lost access. When large institutions make mistakes, losses are socialized. Bailouts, liquidity programs, emergency facilities, different rules, same system. They profit either way. You bear all the risk. And the third trap is timing. By the time instability becomes visible to the public, the architects have already moved. They hedge currencies early. They diversify assets quietly. They gain access to policy discussions you'll never hear about until years later. So, when inflation spikes, they own hard assets. When rates rise, they hold the instruments that benefit. When systems fracture, they sell solutions. This is why every major crisis feels personal, but resolves institutionally. And this is where the anger usually goes wrong. People want a villain, a single name, a single conspiracy. But this isn't about secret plots. This isn't conspiracy. This is incentives playing out exactly as expected. No one has to design suffering deliberately for suffering to emerge. They only have to design systems where upside is private and downside is shared. Now look at this through your own life. You're told to be responsible, to budget, to save, to plan. But you're operating inside a structure where the rules can change faster than your ability to adapt, and where those who write the rules never face the same constraints. That doesn't make you weak. It makes the system asymmetric. And here's the key realization that changes everything. When systems enter late-stage stress, like we're seeing now, they stop rewarding participation and start rewarding positioning. That's why some people seem to get ahead no matter what happens, and others fall behind despite doing everything right. This is the moment where frustration turns into clarity. Because once you see who the system actually serves, you stop internalizing its failures as personal ones. And that clarity is dangerous, not to you, but to narratives that rely on your confusion. Which brings us to the most important question of all. If this is how a weakening empire shows up at the top, what does it look like at the bottom? In your groceries, your rent, your retirement? That's where we're going next. Here's the mistake most people make. They think empire-level problems stay at the empire level. They think currency shifts live in textbooks. They think geopolitics has nothing to do with their kitchen table. But systems don't break at the top first. They break at home. That's because macro stress always expresses itself in micro ways, quietly, relentlessly, and personally. Start with groceries. You're told prices are rising because of supply chains, or weather, or corporate greed, sometimes all three. But underneath that explanation is a deeper truth. When currency trust weakens at the margins, everything priced in that currency becomes more expensive over time. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough that every trip to the store feels slightly heavier than the last. Next is housing. In a stable system, homes are places to live. In a stress system, homes become financial instruments. As interest rates rise to defend the currency, affordability collapses. You're told it's to fight inflation, but the result is the same. Fewer buyers, higher monthly payments, and a generation priced out of ownership. This isn't a housing crisis. It's a currency defense mechanism playing out in your life. Then there's retirement. You're encouraged to trust long-term growth, to stay invested, to ignore volatility. But late-stage systems behave differently. Returns become uneven. Risk concentrates. Drawdowns recover more slowly, if they recover at all. Your savings might still grow on paper, but what those savings can buy shrinks. That's not mismanagement, that's erosion. Now consider healthcare and education. These should be public goods. In stressed systems, they become profit centers. Costs rise faster than wages. Access becomes conditional. Debt replaces opportunity. And finally, jobs. Late-stage systems reward capital over labor. Automation accelerates. Outsourcing returns. Layoffs are framed as efficiency. You're expected to retrain endlessly inside a system that changes faster than stability can form. This is where many people break, not financially, but psychologically. They start blaming themselves. Why can't I get ahead? Why does it feel harder than it used to? Why does doing everything right still feel wrong? Here's the truth you're rarely told. You're not failing. You're living inside stage 4 of a historical pattern, where systems stop working for households and start working exclusively for balance sheets. This isn't a bug. This is the system working exactly as designed. And that realization is both frightening and liberating. Because if the pressure you feel is structural, not personal, then panic stops being useful, and clarity becomes power. Which brings us to the final question. If the system is a trap, and you were born inside it, and leaving it entirely isn't realistic, what can you actually do? Not to beat the system, not to overthrow it, but to stop letting it define your worth, your decisions, and your future. That's where this story ends, and where the real shift begins. Here's the truth most people never hear, because it doesn't benefit the system to say it out loud. You were never meant to feel comfortable inside this structure. You were meant to feel busy, distracted, slightly behind, always catching up. That's not personal failure, that's placement. Every empire in decline tells its citizens the same story. Trust the system, work harder, be patient. And every time, the system quietly shifts risk downward, onto households, onto families, onto people who don't get to change the rules. Seeing that doesn't make you cynical, it makes you historically literate. Because once you understand the pattern, control, weaponization, alternatives, hedging, decay, something important changes inside you. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what stage are we in? That single shift matters more than any financial tip. You realize that struggling in a late-stage system doesn't mean you failed. It means you're living through stage 4 of a cycle that has crushed empires far more powerful than the one you're in now. And here's the quiet relief in that. You don't need to fix the dollar. You don't need to save the empire. You don't need to predict the exact outcome. You only need to stop believing the stories that make you feel small, guilty, or alone. The system wants obedience. It wants faith without understanding. It wants you blaming yourself while structural forces do the damage. Clarity breaks that spell. Not overnight, not dramatically, but permanently. When you see the trap, you stop running faster inside it. You start choosing more carefully. You prioritize resilience over appearances, stability over promises, family over narratives. This isn't financial advice. It's historical perspective. And history is clear about one thing. Those who survive empire-level transitions aren't the loudest or the richest. They're the ones who see the shift early and refuse to panic. If this video helped you see a pattern you couldn't quite name before, share it with one person you care about, not to scare them, but to ground them. And if something clicked for you, type, "I see it" in the comments. Not for me, for yourself. Because once you see the structure, you're no longer lost inside it. In the next video, we'll look at the one group that consistently benefits when empires weaken. Not because they're evil, but because they understand cycles decades ahead of everyone else. And once you understand how they think, you'll never see the system the same way again.